Today's topic is Beyond the Basics, What Nonprofits Need to Know About Volunteer Screening. And so we're joined today by a very, very cool guest, Maggie Benson. And so Maggie here, well, before I talk about Maggie, so my name is Gung, and so I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Civic Champs. For those of that don't know about Civic Champs, we're a volunteer management platform, and so we have these webinars every other week, and so we talk about different volunteer-related topics. These are some of the brands and organizations I've been with, but I'm kind of a serial entrepreneur, if you will, and then but I really enjoy the nonprofit space, so I think I'm gonna stick here for as long as I can, if you all will continue to have me. So, all right, and then yeah, Maggie, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thanks for starting us off, gang. My name is Maggie. I'm the president of SureCheck. We're a background check company. We work with nonprofits, youth organizations, and service businesses to do background checks. And the reason I decided to give this presentation is because we've been starting to have a lot of conversations with nonprofits. And a lot of the times I'll hear that they'll just check the state databases, and you're actually missing a lot of information when you're doing this. So I figured I would create a presentation to educate people on how criminal record reporting works in our country.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited to have you. This is kind of a cool new topic for us. And so, a couple things before we have you dive into your presentation. Everyone always asks, do we share the recording, the slides? So the answer is a yes to both. And so we'll be sharing the recording afterwards and then also the slides. The presentation itself is usually about 30 to 40 minutes. And then if you have questions you want to ask, make sure to leave those in in the chat and sort of all keep track of that. Um, yeah, Maggie, do you want me to interrupt you for questions, or do you want to save those to the end?
You feel free to interrupt me. I think it
Okay.
would be more
Okay.
helpful to answer things as we go.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right. Well, with that, I'll let you take over, share your screen, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your insights.
Alrighty. So am I sharing this correctly now?
Yep. We can see, yeah, we can see your screen. It's not full screen, so we see it's sort of the top banner as well.
Okay. How can I change that?
I think it's the lower left. Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, so we're going to be learning all about volunteer screening today, as we mentioned. This is Gang and all of his amazing accomplishments. Saw that he went to Harvard. That's pretty cool. And actually, that's not an AI generated picture. Fun fact, as I learned earlier today,
Yeah.
just a really nice photo. So this is a little bit about me. I'm the president of SureCheck. As I mentioned, we work with nonprofits and youth organizations to help them build safer practices for their volunteers and employees. I actually used to be an elementary school teacher. I was a school librarian and I also taught third grade. And I recently purchased this company and I thought it was important to work with organizations to educate them on how to properly screen their employees. And I'm kind of between Chicago, Colorado, and Buenos Aires. I'm in Argentina at the moment. And additionally, I also am a children's author and I write books about climate change, and I'm also a yoga teacher. So as he mentioned, we're going to share the slides. It's going to be about between 30 and 40 minutes, and feel free to interrupt and answer any questions throughout the presentation. So before we start, I would love to currently hear, how does your organization handle volunteer screening? Feel free to leave some comments in the chat. I'd love to see what everyone's currently doing. Does anyone have any feedback on how you're currently screening your volunteers, your employees, anyone that's working with kids, seniors, driving a car, handling money, anything that could lead to any level of risk? Okay, so Janelle mentioned they're doing the state background check. Is this what everyone's doing? State checks. I know a lot of the times volunteers like state checks because it's usually under $10 to do a state check. Sometimes they don't screen. General background check, state checks, caregiver check. Some people use Sterling. Some states have caregiver registries, depending on which state you're in. So it kind of depends on the organization. It depends on what the organization is actually doing, if they're working with any type of sensitive populations like kids or seniors. Um, and it's always best practice to screen all of your volunteers as if they were an employee because there's still a level of risk if they're representing your organization. The legal term is respondent superior, which is Latin for let the master answer. So you can, as an organization, you can still be sued for a volunteer's actions in the same way you can be sued for an employee's actions. So this is why it's important to screen all of your volunteers. Because volunteer negligence can be even riskier because often there's less scrutiny with volunteers than there would be with a normal employee. So sometimes this can be overlooked, but all volunteers deserve the same level of vetting, oversight, and accountability as staff because the law treats their actions the same way. So 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record, and not all of these would be visible if you're running a state check. When we surveyed the nonprofits, 47% report that they're skipping volunteer background checks, and the average lawsuit is over $100,000. Even if your organization wins, the defense cost can exceed anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000. So it's important to remember that anytime a volunteer is representing your organization, they're carrying your organization's reputation with us. Because sometimes they're interacting with vulnerable populations, one oversight can unravel your entire organization. You can get shut down, you can be sued, you can end up in the media. So it's really important to just take comprehensive steps to screen all of your volunteers so that you're minimizing your risk as an organization and also protecting the people that you serve. So we already talked about how we handle volunteer screening. So just by running the state background check, you might assume that you're seeing every possible record connected to that individual. But the reality is the way that our country maintains criminal records, there's not just one database. It's a fragmented system. It's made up of local, state, and federal systems. And oftentimes these systems do not talk to each other. So even if you're checking the state record, the counties, which hold 90% of the criminal records, don't always report into the state and vice versa. So it's always best to do a county level search because these are the most up to date and this is where you're going to find the most records. And additionally, if you're only running a state check, if your volunteers lived anywhere in a different state or outside of the country, you're not going to see any of their records if you're only running that state check because that state only maintains its own records. It's not communicating with other states, so you're missing a lot of information by only running a state check. So, for example, misdemeanors, DUIs, assault, theft, and other local crimes are only stored at the county level. So again, you're not going to see these at the state level. Counties maintain their own systems and databases. Some report to the state, others do not. Some are digitized, some are not. So the bottom line is if you're only running a state check, you're going to miss any county that doesn't upload or sync its records. So for example, a volunteer convicted of theft in Cook County, Illinois, it may not appear in the Illinois State Police database for months or ever if the local hasn't transmitted the record. And especially if you have a county that's not digitized, which is 25% in the US, a lot of times it's going to take a long time for those records to appear in any state database. For example, the entire state of New Hampshire is not digitized, so that means their physical court records where we actually have to send in a researcher to go check with the clerk for them to go through the files to actually find if there's any records associated with an individual. So it's always best practice to run county level searches on all your volunteers and employees. So can anyone guess how long does it take for a conviction to show up on a record? After someone's convicted, how long would that take for you to see that in any type of database? Do you want to put some guesses in the chat? 1 year. Okay, 1 month, 1 year. 3 to 6 months. Anyone else? Okay, so those are not that optimistic. Typically at the county level, it's around 72 hours, and at the state level, it's about 1 week. So luckily, It doesn't take as long as a year. That would be a little crazy, but it still takes a little while for a conviction to show up. So because of this, it's important to have a policy in place that you're indicating how often you're going to be screening your volunteers. A lot of times it's considered best practice to screen your volunteers at least once a year because different things can happen. They can have something that came up. Some organizations even use what's something that's called continuous monitoring, where they're basically checking on a daily basis if the person has committed a crime, and if they have, they get an alert. So there's different levels of record keeping in the US. It starts at the county level, and then it goes to the state level, and then federal, and then national. A lot of times, as I mentioned, these systems are not talking to each other. You have to include a layered search anytime you're running a background check because these are disparate systems that don't always update automatically. They're not reporting to each other. So if you're only relying on a single search, like just a nationwide criminal search or just a single state search, you're potentially leaving a lot of blind spots. So national databases are kind of like a flashlight, so they'll show you where to look, but you actually need to check at the county level in order to see the real report of what happened. So county levels are where 90% of criminal records lived. County searches are most up to date. They are accurate, and they show an up-to-date view of a person's criminal history. State searches only cover that specific state. They don't automatically share across state lines, and many states have incomplete databases that miss county level offenses. So a person with a record in one state could easily pass a state-only check if they had previously had a record in a different state. This also goes for motor vehicle history checks. One thing a lot of people don't realize is MVR checks are also state specific. So if your person has lived in any other states, you would need to have them disclose if they have previous driver's license in other states in order to accurately check their complete driving history, because again, each state maintains its own DMV. Federal criminal search, this wouldn't show up at the county level. These cases are prosecuted at the U.S. district courts, include financial crimes, human trafficking, cyber crimes, and offenses that cross state lines. So these would also exist outside of state systems. So these are also essential for a full background check. And then national databases are aggregator searches. So if you're running a national criminal search, it's going to include sex offender registries, watch lists, sanctions lists. It's useful for uncovering potential records quickly, but it's also not comprehensive. This is a good starting point, but it's not a standalone screen. Do we have any questions so far? All right, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so here are some of the databases you should know about. OFAC and watch lists are the Office of Foreign Asset Controls maintains lists of individuals and entities sanctioned for terrorism, fraud, money laundering, and any other serious offense. Same thing for sex offender registries. Each state maintains its own public sex offender registry, which requires convicted people to go to register where they live, work, and go to school. These registers vary in what data they publish. Each state determines how often offenders must check in and what information is made public. Local sheriffs or law enforcement agencies usually handle the updates for this. So as I mentioned, each state maintains its own DMV. Each DMV has its own database of driver history, including their license status, violations, suspensions, and points. This is not a centralized system. So when you run a motor vehicle check, you're only seeing the driving history from the state where the person's license was issued, not any previous states where they've lived or driven in the past. And again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to a social security trace. Sometimes organizations express concern that they're collecting erroneous information about a person by doing a social security trace. So this is not really connected to their social security number. It's more about creating an address history based on their credit history. This is more of a way to do an identity verification. It confirms that the number is valid, and it verifies that the number matches the person's name and date of birth. And it also identifies their previous address history and we use this previous address history to match it to every county that they've lived in at the last 7 years in order to find any criminal records for the last 7 years. So it's not tracing their social security number, it's basically a way of pulling up a person's address history. So each one of these databases serves a specific purpose and reveals different types of risk that standard criminal checks miss entirely. So I included a couple example case studies of what could potentially happen if you're not screening your volunteers correctly. So a neighborhood youth nonprofit allows Vincent to volunteer as a team leader without running a background check. Months later, it's discovered he abused a child in the group. So what they did wrong was they didn't do any type of criminal background check, even though he was going to be working with minors. This person had prior charges for child abuse in different states. The offense would have been revealed through a routine national search, and the organization was found liable for negligent screening. They did not do their due diligence when they were selecting their volunteers working with kids, and the nonprofit could be sued for failing to exercise reasonable care in selecting and overseeing volunteers. Similar abuse-related civil suits often result in settlements between $500,000 and $2 million, depending on the severity, the number of victims, and the perceived negligence. So the lesson here is every volunteer deserves to be vetted with the same care as a staff member because they could be on the hook for negligent screening otherwise. Here's another case study of
Oh,
a large,
Maggie, before we
yeah.
go on to there's a question Janelle asked. Are there fees associated with using these sites?
Um, so typically we offer volunteer background checks. Our standard volunteer background check includes a social security trace, county criminal search, and a nationwide criminal search, and it's around $19. If you wanted to check their driving history, that's an additional fee, but it's usually under $30 total, depending on what the role is and what you actually need to check.
Yep. Yep. And I think, yeah, I think that's around, roughly the same range that I've heard from other folks like Sterling and others that have posted here too. Yeah.
Correct. So it's again a pretty nominal fee, and sometimes organizations have the volunteers pay for it themselves, just in order to make sure you're doing your due diligence, you're protecting your organization, and potentially shielding yourself from any things that could go wrong, worst case scenarios. Thanks for your question. Another example of a case study was a large nonprofit operating shuttle vans for youth programs failed to comply with federal safety regulations requiring drug and alcohol testing because the vehicle had more than 16 passengers. So because they were actually operating under commercial driving regulations, since they had more than 16 passengers in the van, if this is the case, even if it's a volunteer situation, federal rules still apply. You need to do drug and alcohol testing for drivers, and there was a crash. So the nonprofit faced fines and liability for failure to comply with federal DOT safety requirements. So especially if you're going to have volunteers operating a vehicle, it's really important to do a motor vehicle history check. And especially if the vehicle has more than 16 passengers, it's considered commercial. So you'd also be required to do DOT specific drug testing. So it's just important to be aware of all the rules when it comes to driving, being around kids, anything that carries any level of increased liability. There's usually regulations around what you need to do for the people in those roles. And then for the third case study, this is a real example of an individual in South Carolina in 2018. The guy's name was Jacob Hazlitt. He was a volunteer in a South Carolina church program, and he was caught sexually abusing children in the program on surveillance video. This happened multiple times, which was captured on camera. And this person volunteered at a variety of different churches in North Carolina and Ohio. And the lawsuits allege that there had been concerns about his performance at the prior churches, but nobody had checked with the previous places that he worked with. He even had a juvenile record at the age of 17 in Ohio, so in a different state, where he was charged with a sexual crime involving a young child, and what he later pled to a lesser charge. So the lesson here is that criminal charges only show after the age of 18. So because he was charged as a minor, this wouldn't show up. So unless you're charged as an adult, this doesn't appear on a normal background check search. So even though this was a serious charge, this was handled in a juvenile court, not an adult court. And under the law in Ohio, juvenile records are automatically sealed or expunged if no further offenses occur. So these aren't considered criminal convictions. So background checks, especially standard volunteer level ones, typically only return adult convictions, not juvenile crimes. So this case also happened. His initial crime was in Ohio, but he was volunteering in South Carolina. Again, these states' repositories are not going to speak to each other. So you're not going to
Hmm.
find information from the state of Ohio if you're doing a South Carolina criminal check. So even if they had done a background check, that wouldn't have come up. So the best thing to do in this case is if you have your volunteers working with sensitive populations like kids or seniors, it's important to do a reference check as well, just to make sure you're limiting your liability and conducting county level searches everywhere the person has lived to find any disqualifying records.
Hmm. And Maggie, another question came in from Aaron. Can an organization be negligent if a volunteer gets into an accident on the way to a volunteer site in their own vehicle? So this is maybe a little bit different, but yeah, any thoughts there, Maggie?
So I got a similar question from a cleaning company because a lot of times cleaning companies are using contractors as their cleaners, and the cleaners are operating vehicles, they're driving to different job sites. And the answer I got was yes, both would be liable in that case. So I would assume it's the same for volunteers. If volunteers are working for your organization, if they're driving a vehicle, the organization carries liability because they're working for the organization. I'm not a lawyer. I haven't
Yeah.
double checked that specifically, but that would be my best guess answer.
And Maggie, do you think it matters if it was on their way to versus like in the act of? If that does that make sense?
I think it would the organization would still carry liability just based on my best guess. I would have to double check that because that's a good question and I'm not sure.
Okay.
So here's what best practices look like for nonprofits. So when you are interpreting the results of what comes back on the background check, it's important to have your staff members trained in how to look at these results because they are coming directly from county court systems, and sometimes even different crimes can be classified differently. So something that might be a misdemeanor in one state could be a felony charge in a different one. So it's important to have your staff trained in how to interpret the results. After you look at the results, you need to document the actions that you take. Make sure you're following FCRA guidelines meticulously. Certain states like California can be even more strict, so it's important to check what your specific state guidelines are when it comes to interpreting background check results. Clear communication throughout the process builds trust. Explain why you screen, what you're looking for, how long it takes. Sometimes organizations even ask volunteers if they're going to find anything on the background check. Um, so sometimes you can have false confidence just because there's no record found. It could mean the record hasn't been uploaded yet. Typically, it happens within 72 hours. And just screening your volunteers initially. So some organizations can have the same volunteers for years and years. So if that person did a background check 10 years ago and they were never rescreened, you're creating a level of liability because you're not annually rescreening. So it's important to check people every year, especially for higher risk roles. Um, Screening some volunteers thoroughly while giving others a pass can also create liability. So it's important to have a process for all the volunteers in order to mitigate risks. Being consistent is your best defense, and a screening policy is only as strong as your commitment to applying it uniformly across all volunteers without exceptions.
There's another question that came in, Maggie, around you talked quite a bit about county level checks. And so somebody asked, Linda Lamb said, if somebody commits a crime in a county they don't live in, how do you find that? Presumably doing county level checks of where they live wouldn't pick that up, right? Or would
Correct.
it?
So it depends on the crime. Sometimes it would come up on a nationwide criminal search. But again, that's a great question. These we're only searching the counties where people lived in, so it's only going to come up if it was a county they lived in. If they did it with in a state that they were on vacation, it wouldn't come up.
And then Jacob asks, what's the best way to add this to a volunteer onboarding? Do they get a link, or how do volunteers complete this process?
So you can set it up with a link. Some platforms, I'm not sure if Civic Champs have like a lot of volunteer management platforms have background checks as a feature. Um, you can set it up so your volunteers are putting all their information in yourself. You can set it up so that you're putting in their social security number and their address and all that. It kind of just depends on how your organization wants to handle it.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
So to sum everything up, as I said, state background checks alone are not comprehensive. Criminal records exist in isolated systems that require multiple types of searches. It's important to know your data sources and understand what each database does and doesn't reveal about a candidate's history. Match the screening depth to the role risk using a documented process, and rescreen your volunteers annually and maintain documentation of your entire screening process. So I've included a volunteer screening policy template that you guys will all have access to. And I'm also offering a free screening audit. So you can schedule a complimentary 30-minute call with me so we can go over the gaps in your screening process and give you personalized recommendations for your organization's specific needs. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any additional questions at this time.
Cool. Awesome. And then yeah, Jacob had another question, which is how many can you run in a month? Is it unlimited in terms of background checks?
There's no limit. I mean, however many you need, we can require to software, so there's not any um, limits to how many you can run. We don't have any monthly fees or monthly minimums, so if you're only running one a year, we even work with organizations who don't require them any background checks. So it just depends on however many you need can be processed.
Cool. Yeah, any other questions from folks? Or yeah, as you're thinking about it, yeah, continue to put those in chat. Um, yeah, I guess, real quickly while we're waiting, let me just reshare my screen real briefly too. So, we'll come here. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, so please do put in additional questions if you have more here in chat. We'd love to make sure we answer everyone's questions here, right? But while we're waiting, just real quick, kind of a 30-second interruption ad on Civic Champs. So for if you're new to us, so we do volunteer management software, like I mentioned earlier. We work with a lot of different vendors and partners. And so we help everyone from onboarding and recruiting to scheduling, tracking, and reporting. And so today's topic obviously is on the onboarding side of things. Some of the things people always ask, what are we known for? So best value, which means we're relatively inexpensive, and best ease of use, right? And so real quickly, we have everything from a mobile app to website features, but you can see here, this is our mobile app that allows for really easy check-ins. We could also collect feedback from your volunteers, and then we make reporting really easy as well. So you can see this is one of our reporting screens. And then we also have integrations with folks like Blackbaud and Little Green Light, so that all your data can flow to your donor platform. And so, yeah, so wanted to share that real quickly. Let's see if any other questions have come up, though, while we were waiting. Perfect. I think I see two. Perfect. All right. And so Carrie asks, would this also be an option for adopters? I assume that is for uh, either um, adoptions for kids or maybe for animals, either or. I guess Maggie, yeah, your thoughts? Dog
Definitely.
adoptions. Yeah, curious.
As long as you have a signed authorization form, you can run a background check for those types of cases.
Great. And then Kimberly asks, how do you handle international applicants/background checks? We get a lot of interest from visa holders in volunteering, but don't currently have a way to run those types of background checks.
So actually, we offer international background checks. We work in over 200 different jurisdictions. So we do county or local level criminal searches in 200 different, actually, I think closer to 225 countries and jurisdictions. So we handle international checks as well.
Wow, yeah, there you go. You'll just have to make sure you ask them where they're from, and then you can do a check that way. So, any other questions from folks? I'm also leaving, right? Obviously, you see our contact info here, so feel free to reach out to Maggie, or if you have additional questions, you can have her not Instagram, LinkedIn link right there, along with her email.